Well, it just mimics the time of the Soviet Union, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, they're threatening more sanctions against Russia. It was certainly in a period of escalating conflict between the West and Russia.
The Cuban Missile conflict took place when Washington was led by a man who, like Jimmy Carter, had some measure of decency and integrity within him, even while he was playing games with Marilyn Monroe and so on. Jack Kennedy was genuinely sorry over the attempt by the CIA to overthrow the Indonesian government. He was genuinely sorry of the fact that the Zionists had taken control through an agreement, a contract, of a mountain of gold in Indonesia, which was being mined. And the Indonesian government could not recover it. The contract was signed by the previous Dutch government. And when Kennedy became president of the United States, he made an effort to try to correct these wrongs. And that was when he reached out to Sukarno and invited Sukarno to come to Washington. And to his credit, Sukarno was courageous enough to accept the invitation because there was a lot of hatred for the United States in Indonesia. After all, the Indonesians had shot down an aeroplane and captured the pilot, the American pilot who worked for the CIA. And when they captured that pilot, and he confessed that I worked for the CIA, and this is a CIA plot to overthrow the government, that man would have faced a death penalty in Indonesia. His wife in the United States appealed to Sukarno to forgive her husband and set him free. And Sukarno showed magnanimity by forgiving the man and sending him back to his wife. There was a lot of hatred for the United States in Indonesia. So when Kennedy invited Sukarno, it was a surprise. But Sukarno accepted that. A surprise that the invitation was extended, and a surprise that he accepted. And the Zionists didn't like that one bit. And don't you ever forget that the Soviet Union was created by the Zionists. When Sukarno went to the United States, they planned for him, the press, the media, to try to destroy him at the very beginning. So at the first press conference, they cornered him. Mr. President, what's the difference between an American politician and an Indonesian politician? The question was loaded because they wanted to have a discussion on American democracy and Indonesian democracy. That's what they wanted. Sukarno had a brilliant reply. He said, American politicians kiss the baby and shake the mother's hands. Indonesian politicians shake the baby's hand and kiss the mother's. The Zionist press was appalled because there was no way they could respond to this man. The rest of America was laughing. The rest of America loved him. Jack Kennedy loved him because both Jack Kennedy and Sukarno loved women. And he didn't have any problem for the rest of his talk. Jack Kennedy supported Sukarno for Indonesia to recover control of the gold, the mining of gold. The Zionists didn't like that. And so when Kennedy was assassinated, and thank Allah that we now have a confession from Jackie Kennedy herself, Jacqueline Kennedy, that she says, I suspect Lyndon Johnson to be the man who was a part and parcel of the assassination of my husband. She just said that. It just came out. As soon as Kennedy was assassinated, what's the first thing that Johnson did? The very first thing that Johnson did was to reverse American policies on Indonesia. That's what the first thing. The Cuban Missile Crisis has to be understood in the context of a Zionist world order which is becoming increasingly.
Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country in the world, is that right?
After the world of Islam had been broken up into bits and pieces, then one of the pieces is Indonesia, and it's the biggest of the pieces. Instead of saying it's the biggest Muslim country in the world, you could say out of the many pieces that now exist, this is the biggest piece. Yeah, this is the biggest piece, yeah. Okay, we were talking about Indonesia and the United States, Indonesia and the Zionists in the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis, to get a better handle on Kennedy and to go behind the scenes to try to discern the story which has never as yet been told, in respect of the confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States over Cuba. That story has never yet been told, and I don't think that I myself totally understand it, but I have some inklings of what it could be, the inner story. Yeah. Now, when one of the reasons why they so badly wanted Sukarno, that they eventually had to pull off that stunt with Suharto, who was a junior military officer, and they had to slaughter 5, I think, Indonesian generals of the armed forces. 5 of them were killed in order for Suharto to take over the country. And the other one jumped out of the window and saved Nasution. And then Suharto proceeded to rule over Indonesia on behalf of the Zionists for some 30 years until his time was up. But one of the reasons why they so badly wanted Sukarno, I never knew it, was that when Indonesia became independent of the Dutch, Sukarno called in some of the scholars of Islam to talk to them about the Indonesian money. And after he heard what the scholars of Islam had to say, he offered a proposal, a suggestion, that the Indonesian rupiah in paper would function essentially as a promissory note, as a check, and it would be redeemable in gold at the rate of 20 Indonesian rupiah, being equivalent to 2 ounces of gold, or 2 ounces of gold, probably. A scholar, an Indonesian scholar, wrote a book on the gold dinar and the silver dirham in the context of Indonesia. And in that book, he documented this information from direct sources that this was what Sukarno wanted. But this is not what the Zionists wanted. No. They wanted a monetary system that could be disengaged from gold. And that's why the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund, which was, I think, in 1945, 44, 45, prohibited the use of gold as money. Yeah. So this is yet one more reason why the Zionists and the CIA were gunning for Sukarno and Indonesia. Now, what is the untold story behind the Cuban Missile Crisis? I am sure one day it will come out. But I'm sure that what we know of as the official story of 2 combatants who are in mortal combat with each other, and it could have come about to a nuclear war. That could have happened, a nuclear war. I believe, Maurice, that there's more to it than meet the eye. I believe that the Cuban Missile Crisis may have offered an opportunity for those who wanted to get rid of Kennedy to, to give him a battering in the polls, to make him unpopular. The fact that Kennedy was able to make a deal with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw her missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American withdrawal of missiles from Turkey. That agreement was never published. The world never knew about that agreement. All that the world knew was that the Soviet Union had agreed to withdraw her missiles from Turkey, from Cuba. That Kennedy was able to save himself from a lynching from American people. I hope that one day that story will come out of what was the behind the scenes in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the Soviet Union acted on behalf of the Zionists, clearly, without any doubt, in handing over Crimea to Ukraine in 1954. And then the Zionist plan unfolded with the dismantling of the Soviet Union, so that NATO could then take over all the states in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, which were not a part of Russia. And NATO proceeded to do precisely that. But the apple of all was Ukraine, to get Ukraine to become a member of NATO. If Ukraine could become a NATO member by Russia in Crimea. And that's what happened last December, after April, with the demonstrations in Kiev, and eventually the Ukrainian president having to flee. The way Russia responded, I told you, gave to the Zionists the most significant setback they've ever experienced in their history, with the loss of Crimea. So Russia remains firmly in control of a naval base, and Russia remains a naval power in the Black Sea. Now all that remains is for the drama to play out in Ukraine, which eventually might lead to the big war, might lead. Zionists have to choose when they want to have big war. But Russia is showing that she's not prepared to back down. No, she's not prepared to back down. And she's going to give you a tit for tat. Every single ruse and deception you use against her, she'll use it against you. And so she's doing that now in Ukraine. It's inevitable that the big war will take place. That's inevitable. And the inevitable that when the big war takes place, I believe Morris is going to wipe out Europe and North America. Nobody can live in Europe and North America after that big war, because it's thousands of nuclear weapons that are going to be used. And this is what Israel wants. But the good news is that Russia will survive Armageddon. Russia will survive the Melhama. How do we know that? We know that from the prophecy of Prophet Muhammad, Allah's blessings be upon him, about the conquest of Constantinople in the end time. And both Christian eschatology and Islamic eschatology speak with one voice on this issue of the conquest of Constantinople in the end time. From the side of Islam, we know more. But the conquest of Constantinople will take place on the basis of an alliance between Muslims and Orthodox Christians. There's only one military significance, only one, of such a conquest of Constantinople. It break the back of NATO in Constantinople, and therefore release the Bosphorus from the control of the Zionists. And the release of the Bosphorus from the control of the Zionists has only one military implication. That's of significance. And that is that the Russian Navy can now pass through the Bosphorus. So when we read, we realize that Russia is going to survive this big war. And the Russian Navy will still survive. Wars will not be fought after the nuclear war with anything in the sky. No. After the big war, the way wars are going to be fought is on the land and the sea. And Russia will remain a naval power. And that navy, Russian navy, is going to threaten Israel.
Quite an education, and an amazing parallel with the Cuban Missile Crisis and what is happening today with Ukraine. I mean, NATO would gladly put missiles in Ukraine.
In the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Russia was still under the control of a Zionist-created Soviet Union. So the Zionists had control on both sides. But with Kennedy, that control is beginning to slip out of their hands. And we saw a dramatic example of that in Kennedy's relationship with Sukarno in Indonesia. The story of Kennedy and Sukarno is still so sensitive that the man who wrote that book, let me show it to you. Hold on a minute. His name is Sheikh Al-Faroji. He's Indonesian. And this is his book. This is his book. Yeah. Sheikh Al-Faroji. It is not in English. It is in Indonesian. But he gave me a copy. This is the manuscript, not the published one. It's still being published. Manuscript form. The Return of Dinar Dirham by Sheikh Al-Faroji Asmar Khan, who's Hafiz of the Quran. That book had to be censored in order to be published. And he had to take out of the book certain portions, that I've just mentioned in my interview with you.